So a lot of times here I'm going to mention two things. I'm going to mention like the RJP Williams stuff that I originally got the data from, and I'll show you some of his figures, and then I'm going to show you some of the data that I actually got part of the book from. I was afraid to put this in the book, because the book's hard enough to read as it is, right? But I want to process the data a little bit in the book. But in this talk, I want to show you the actual data so that you can see for yourself what the conclusions are. And so there's really two parts. We're going to talk about some different things that different metals and what they can do with different reactions. You'll notice this is all metals reacting with gases, but particular metals doing particular jobs is the theme of the first part. And then I'm going to have some examples about how oxygen changed which metals were available. And the two parts go together because if these two things happened, if metals have particular jobs and if oxygen made different metals available, that means that particular jobs were available at particular times. And so time is an axis upon which we should think. So I'm going to go through these examples. Each of these is like a paper that I don't want you to read the paper. I want you to understand the paper. So this is my takeaway from this paper is that iron works in a certain way with hydrogen. And this is interesting because it's geology. It has olivine-based interstellar grains. That basically means like asteroids that are floating around. On their surface, they have a bunch of iron in the form of olivine. Could that iron act as a catalyst? And it turns out that just the form of iron that's in olivine can act as a catalyst. Now, Dr. Schofield can tell you a lot more about the methods here. We're not about the methods here. Definitely he'd love it if you asked him about DFT because I think he uses those methods. But what he does is he doesn't do this on an asteroid. He doesn't do this in real life. He does it in calculations. And so these are calculations and simulations of interstellar hydrogen adsorption. And what it is it's a classic sort of PChem type reaction because you have H going to H2. You really have the bond forming and iron catalyzing that bond formation. Okay? Now the one thing about olivine isn't just iron. It's actually iron, magnesium, silicon, and oxygen all put together. So they're modeling it in this complex. The most complex thing here is the structure, the crystal structure of the olivine. But it seems that from that particular complexity, you can actually have a specific catalyst that an asteroid could be a catalyst for making hydrogen, making diatomic hydrogen from monatomic. So this is what they do. They model the olivine like this, and you see it's a crystal structure. It's mostly magnesium. It's got a few little irons scattered in. And that even makes sense because iron is one of the biggest things here. Iron is bigger than magnesium, and you can imagine an asteroid may have more abundance of magnesium than iron just because of how much has been made or something like that. So I'm not sure if that's true or not, but it makes sense to me. And this is the complex thing that we're looking at to see if this crystal structure can catalyze stuff. So what they did in the computer, they basically calculated how much energy would it be for hydrogen to be this far away from this iron. How much energy would it be for hydrogen to be this far away from this oxygen, from this other oxygen, and from this magnesium, okay? Silicon's not going to bind it anyway, so we didn't even do that. But they label these this way, and the important thing is the metal or the element that you see there is the thing that's bonding the monatomic hydrogen. So for the reaction to happen, what you have to have happen is the hydrogen has to bond, and then the idea is if you have two hydrogens that are close enough to each other, that instead of bonding the surface, they'll end up bonding each other. Like the electrons will form a bond between them, that they'll be like this, and then they'll see each other and form a bond and be released. And that could be how an asteroid could work as a catalyst. So they actually take the atomic orbitals and they calculate what the strength of bonding would be in these different situations. And the one thing you see is what they saw in their calculations is that iron does one of its little tricks that only iron can really do. And technically, a few other metals can do these kind of tricks as well. But in this context, only iron can switch its charges. And you've got to remember, bonding is bringing electrons close to something. It's sharing electrons between these two atoms. When bonding happens to the iron, the electrons in the hydrogen influence the electrons in the iron. And it turns out that when you bring hydrogen close to iron, it actually switches to a 3+ configuration. So they found out that, you bring hydrogen close to this surface, it could do this thing on top, or it could do this thing on bottom. The thing on top, when it binds oxygen, is H+, because oxygen pulls away all the electrons. But when it binds the iron, it's actually H-. It keeps a lot of the electrons so that it basically keeps a lot of the electronic charge. Bond forms in each case, but the question is the bond is unequally shared. With oxygen, the oxygen pulls away the electrons. With hydrogen, with iron, the hydrogen keeps more of the electrons, so it has more negative charge on it. And you see that in this case, the iron starts off as 2+. When it binds over here, the iron goes to 1+ when it binds the oxygen because the electrons communicate with each other. When it binds the iron directly, the iron goes to 3+. And that has to do with all the bonds and how the electrons move through the bonds. You couldn't really necessarily predict this without a computer. But when you add it all up, you can see this is what's happening with the pluses and minuses. One explanation for why does iron do this is because when it goes to this configuration, 3+ configuration, it actually has 5 electrons in the d orbitals as opposed to 6 electrons in the 5 d orbitals. And this is actually lower energy to have 5 rather than 6 because it has more entropy. They can all be the same spin, and they can be indistinguishable from each other, therefore. So rather than having 4 of one type and 1 of another type, you have 5 all of one spin, and because those are all degenerate, more configurations, so I want you to remember that part of a previous data talk. More configurations means lower energy. So they calculated all the different things that iron can do, and they show you a picture of each state, and then they show you the energy, the calculated energy of each state over here. And so you see in all of these cases, you end up with one hydrogen bound to one atom and one hydrogen bound to a different atom, and then depending on the distance between them, they're more likely to find each other. Of course, if they're right next to each other, they're even more likely to find each other, but it turns out that being 6 angstroms apart from each other, that's still enough for them to see each other. You can see it happening right here. If you have one bound to the iron, one bound to the magnesium, they start to see each other, and there's a transition state where they start to lean in toward each other, and then they bond each other, and they get energy out of that bond. Their energy goes down, and it becomes a more stable arrangement, and you make H2. So this is actually the full reaction picture that we have right here with reactants, transition state, and products. So remember that we can find an energy level like of a transition state. We talked about that at the end of chapter 6, right? And at the end of chapter 6, we said that you can assign an energy to this transition state. So they're just doing that in the computer. But they're also measuring the difference of energy levels between reactants and products. So let me ask a question. This is deliberately vague question, so I want you to sort of ask me what I'm asking. What question do you ask me? If I say, from these energies, so you have iron and magnesium reacting to make H2. You have oxygen and magnesium. They're closer, right? But oxygen is also much more electronegative. They can react to make H2 as well. And then iron and oxygen can react to make H2. Okay, so they did all 3 scenarios where you could have this catalyzing the hydrogen forming. Which of these works best? Look at those energies. You have 9 energies, right? 3 for each reaction. Which reaction works best? So feel free to try to answer that or to ask me a question about what do I mean by works best, What do you notice about how this reaction works from the energies? Yes, when you have to ask, do I mean kinetics or do I mean thermodynamics? So when you pointed out the transition state, that's clearly one of the two, right? That's clearly kinetics. So you're saying which one of these works fastest, okay? There's also the question of which one of these makes the most products or has the most stable product. But there's a wrinkle with that. I mean, you can answer the same answer happens for both of these. You know, you can say the lowest transition state will happen fastest. The products will be our lowest also for this. The difference between reactants and products. This will produce more. So faster production, more production of H2. There's just one little wrinkle, and it's one of the reasons why I said works best. What's the problem with the top one? The fact that the products are so low in the top one. So the energy gaps are really different. That means you'll make a lot of this H2, right? But what will be true because the gaps are really different, because this is so low, it'll be hard to reverse the reaction or to release. It could be more stable. All of these are the same H2 molecule, so once it's released, they'll all have the same energy. The problem is you have the product sticking to the catalyst. But they're not really thinking about that. They're more concerned, and they're not really concerned with whether it gets released or not. And the reverse reaction, Catherine, is actually very true. It's a true thing that makes this good as well, because you got to remember that these are catalyzing the forward and backward reaction, and so it will be extremely slow to go backward. Extremely slow and also unstable relative to that. So two good things, fast forward, slow backward. One bad thing, possibly binding to the catalyst very tightly. Okay, so when I ask a question that's vague like that on a test, sometimes I want you to sort of take it apart that way. I want you to sort of say, well, if by best you mean fastest, I can definitely say this. And that's the main thing that we are talking about here. This is a really low transition state. Compare it to the other two. Even though it's very distant, it works better to have both metals working together than to have either metal working with oxygen, even though they're closer. So I think that's interesting as well. It's the metals that are really good for chemistry here. So remember that iron is able to do this in part because it's a special ion, and the fact that it becomes iron 3 actually helps the reaction move along, because the iron 3 ends up with more electrons still on the hydrogen, and that makes it able to bond another hydrogen more easily. So remember the iron's flipping from 2 to 3. It helps it do that hydrogen reaction, and it also can help it form, like when it reacts with sulfur, it's part of the reason why you get iron-sulfur clusters. So when you react iron with sulfur, you don't just get the simple iron plus sulfur arrangement. You can get chunks of iron that are arranged slightly differently. You can get all these structures from just iron and sulfur. And in the last case, if you mix in with a little molybdenum, you get this structure, which is a stable rock geology type structure. But you may remember this from the book. It's actually drawn in the book. This is the heart of nitrogenase enzyme. And so this does very special chemistry, but it's really just a little bit of rock. The iron's important, as well as the sulfur and the molybdenum in that last case. So iron's just really cool because it can make all these shapes. Iron-sulfur clusters can be actually found, it can be stored as those clusters, or actually the way your body stores it stores it in a protein called ferritin that stores it in the hydroxide form. Iron's happy to bind to pretty much everything, so it can be stored in multiple forms. And these are produced in sulfur-rich seawater. And I'm just remembering, I saw a talk right now where they went down to the hydrogen-making vents, right? And in the hydrogen vents, they have a whole bunch, they actually measured these clusters. And so you can see them floating around.
Aren't there iron-sulfur clusters?
Yeah. Yeah, we don't have as many of them as bacteria do, but in the citric acid cycle. Yeah, if you remember Biochem 2, citric acid cycle, aconitase has this one, this 4Fe4S structure. And of course, you can predict which amino acid. Let me ask, since you all are biochemists, let me bring the amino acids back. Which amino acid do you think binds the iron in aconitase? Remember that what we're talking about is FeS. What's that? Yeah, deliberately why. Methionine has sulfur in it, but the sulfur in methionine is capped off with a methyl group. So methionine would be good, but not best. Cysteine. So cysteines are SH groups. And so that's just a little, if you're ever like, maybe they'll ask a question like that on the MCAT, who knows. But who wants to take the MCAT though? So yeah, but it's just really interesting to me because a lot of people talk about, you know, how unlikely is it that a protein will be made that will catalyze this reaction? Well, an asteroid was made that would catalyze a hydrogen-making interaction just from its rock structure. Proteins have little bits of rock in them, and little bits of rock are floating around. So it seems to me that asking about the protein may be looking in the wrong place. Maybe you should ask, does the body actually put hydrogen together? And it actually uses an iron-sulfur cluster to put hydrogen together. This is an example of an early iron-sulfur cluster. It doesn't look exactly like the asteroid because the body's a very different environment. But what's cool about this, it looks kind of like the asteroid. It has kind of the crystal structure. It looks more like the asteroid than it looks like a protein, for one thing. And it can do this chemistry. And you can see that it can bind these ligands. And what's extra cool about this is a particular hydrogenase. And look what's bound to it. Cyanide, carbon monoxide, you know, as well as all the sulfurs. All three of these things were around in abundance before oxygen. So it's an idea that this might still have some of the relics of that old time just because it worked that way back then. To keep it working, it kept making the cyanide, kept making CO because it kept the enzyme working. Oh, and by the way, I didn't plan this, but look, there's our cysteine right there bound to the FeS cluster.